She did not scream when her sister took the shears to her hair. She simply sat there, in the cold of that locked room, watching dark coils fall to the stone floor like something being buried. "No one will want you now," Isolde had said, tucking the key into her bodice with a smile that had never once reached her eyes.
"No one will want you now.
You were always too much.
You were always too much.
Too noticed.
Too bright, too noticed."
And for 3 months, Araminta Voss believed her. She stopped counting the days. She stopped standing at the window. She stopped hoping. Until the morning, a carriage bearing a gold crest rolled through the gates. Until the morning, someone came asking for her, specifically for her by a name. Her sister had told the whole of London she no longer existed. And the voice that carried through the walls? It was not gentle. It was not polite. It was the voice of a man who had not come to call. He had come to find her. If you already have a feeling about where this is going, drop it in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit the subscribe button. We are just getting started. The morning the carriage came, Araminta had been sitting on the floor. Not because there was nowhere to sit. There was a narrow bed against the wall, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, and a small wooden stool she had long since stopped using. She sat on the floor because it was the coldest part of the room, and cold was the only thing that still made her feel like she was real, like her body was still hers, like she was still someone who existed in the world beyond that locked door, and those thick stone walls, and the silence that had become so familiar, she had almost started to love it. 3 months. That was how long she had been inside this room on the east wing of Voss House, a place her father had built for guests who never came, and parties that were never thrown. The east wing was always cold, always quiet, always forgotten. Her sister had chosen it deliberately. Isolde had always had a talent for choosing things that hurt. Araminta pressed her back against the wall and pulled her knees to her chest and breathed. That was what she did now. She breathed. She counted the light that moved across the floor from the single window above her head, too high to look out of without standing on the stool, and some mornings she did not have the will to stand. Some mornings breathing was enough. She reached up and touched the ends of her hair. It stopped at her jaw now, uneven and blunt, where the shears had gone through it carelessly, as if the cutting itself had been an afterthought, as if Isolde had not planned it for weeks, as if it had not been the most deliberate thing her sister had ever done to her. She remembered the weight of it before, the dark length of it, past her shoulders and down her back, the kind of hair that people noticed. That was why Isolde had done it. Because people noticed. Because at the Aldenmere ball last spring, the Duke himself had noticed, and he had looked at Araminta in the way that men in their world looked when they were deciding something, when something had shifted inside them, and Isolde had seen it, and had smiled her small, cold smile, and said nothing at all. And Araminta had not understood what that smile meant until 3 weeks later, when she found herself locked in this room with shorn hair and a door that would not open from the inside. She had been 19 years old. She was almost 20 now. The sound of wheels on gravel was so unexpected that she did not move at first. Carriages came to Voss House sometimes. Men came to call on Isolde, who had positioned herself as the only daughter of Lord Voss worth knowing, the only daughter who was present and accounted for and available for the kind of social arrangements that kept families like theirs afloat. Araminta had learned to ignore the sound of wheels. She had learned to press herself smaller whenever she heard voices in the house, because hope was a dangerous thing, and she had used most of hers up. But this sound was different. The wheels were heavier. The horses were more than 2. She rose from the floor slowly, the cold of the stone still in her bones, and she dragged the stool beneath the window and climbed up and looked out and felt something crack open in her chest. The crest on the carriage door was gold on black. She knew it. Everyone in London knew it. It was the crest of the Duke of Aldenmere, one of the oldest titles in England, a name that appeared in histories and scandals and the kind of stories that women told each other in low voices at the edges of ballrooms. And the carriage had stopped, not at the front where guests were received. It had stopped at the gate, and the gate was still closed, and from the upper window she could see a figure standing beside it, and she knew even from that distance, even with 3 months of hunger and silence and diminishment sitting inside her, she knew the shape of him. Evander Ashcroft, Duke of Aldenmere. He was not a soft man, he never had been. She had seen him 3 times in her life, and each time he had given the impression of something that had been made rather than born, carved from a harder material than the men who surrounded him, and polished to a quiet, dangerous shine. He was tall in the way that was difficult to ignore, dark-haired, with a face that gave very little away, and eyes that gave away rather more than he probably intended. She had noticed his eyes at the Aldenmere ball, how they had moved across the room and then stopped, and she had felt the stopping before she had understood it. A stillness, a settling, as if he had been looking for something and had found it without expecting to. He had looked at her for exactly 4 seconds. She had counted. She had thought about those 4 seconds rather more than she would ever admit. Now he was standing at the gate of her father's house, and he was not alone. There were 2 men with him, both standing slightly behind, both wearing the same careful stillness of people paid to be useful rather than visible. But it was not them she was watching. It was him. The way he stood at that gate, as if he had every right to be there, and would not be moved by anything less than a direct act of God. She watched him say something to the man who had come out from the house to meet him. She was too far away to hear the words, but she could read the shape of them in the stiffening of the servant's back, in the way the man's head turned toward the house and then turned back, uncertain. She could see the conversation going badly for the servant. She had a feeling she knew why he had come. She had a feeling that frightened her more than the locked door ever had. Because if he was here for her, if somehow he knew, if 3 months of her disappearance from every drawing room and dinner table and social occasion in London had eventually, impossibly, led him to this gate, then something was about to change. And change, after this long in a room that did not change, was the most terrifying thing she could imagine. She climbed down from the stool. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the door that had not opened in 3 months, and listened to the sounds of the house below, shifting, tightening, becoming alert in the way that houses became alert when something unexpected had arrived at their door. Then she heard Isolde's voice, moving fast through the corridor outside, clipped, controlled. But underneath the control there was something else, something Araminta had not heard in her sister's voice in a very long time. Isolde was afraid. And from somewhere below, low and unhurried and carrying the particular quality of a man who was not accustomed to being made to wait, came a voice that said, one thing and one thing only. He had not come to ask if she was there. He had come because he already knew. Araminta pressed her palm flat against the locked door and felt the wood vibrate faintly with the life of the house on the other side of it, and she thought, with a clarity she had not felt since before the shears and before the silence and before all of it, that perhaps she had not been entirely forgotten after all. But what she did not know, what she could not have known standing in that cold room with her short hair and her bare feet on the stone floor, was that the Duke of Aldenmere had not simply come out of concern or curiosity or the kind of gentlemanly obligation that sometimes moved men of his standing to involve themselves in matters that were not their own. He had come because of something he had discovered, something that had made him leave London in the middle of the season without a word to anyone. Something that, when Araminta eventually learned what it was, would change everything she thought she understood about why her sister had locked her away in the first place. The first thing Araminta ever understood about her family was that she was the wrong daughter. Not in the way that could be said aloud, not in the way that fathers announced at dinner tables or mothers admitted in quiet moments. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in the spaces between things. in the way her mother had always reached for Isolde first when entering a room, in the way her father's eyes moved past her at social gatherings, not unkindly, but as if she were a piece of furniture he had grown so accustomed to that he no longer really saw it, in the way Isolde had always known exactly where to stand to catch the most light, and Araminta had always found herself standing slightly behind, slightly to the left, slightly out of frame. She had not hated her sister for it. That was the truth she carried most quietly. Even now, even after everything, she could not reach the clean feeling of hatred. What she felt was more tangled than that, more honest and more painful. She had loved Isolde once with the particular fierceness of a younger sister who does not yet understand that the person she is reaching toward is not reaching back. Their mother had died when Araminta was 11. A fever that moved fast and left no room for goodbyes. The kind of death that took things from a family that could never be replaced, or even properly named. Their father had grieved badly, which meant he had grieved silently, which meant the house had gone very quiet, and the two girls had learned to take up very little space, because space felt dangerous when adults were breaking apart inside it. Isolde had responded to their mother's death by becoming useful. She had learned to run the household at 13 with a competence that made adults nod approvingly and say things like, "remarkable," and such a steady head for her age. She had become the daughter their father could point to when the weight of his grief required something solid to lean on. She had shaped herself into exactly what was needed, and she had done it so completely that there was no longer much room for anything else inside her. No softness, no uncertainty, just usefulness and beauty, and the particular coldness of a person who has learned that feeling things costs too much. Araminta had responded to their mother's death by feeling everything. She had cried openly and read hungrily and asked too many questions and made too many observations and laughed at wrong moments and gone still and serious at moments when levity was expected. She had been, by any measure their world applied, too much. A girl who took up exactly as much space as she actually needed, which was more than anyone was prepared to give her. She had come out into society the year she turned 18, half a season behind Isolde, who had already positioned herself as the most composed and elegant of the Voss daughters, and who watched Araminta's entrance into their social world with an expression that Araminta had foolishly read as pride. She understood now that it had not been pride. The rooms she had entered that first season had surprised her. She had expected the stiffness she saw at home, the management, the careful performance of correct feeling at correct moments. What she had found instead was something that moved beneath the formal surface of everything, a current of genuine human longing that people were very bad at hiding even when they tried hardest to hide it. She had found it compelling. She had leaned toward it naturally, the way she had always leaned toward things that felt real, and people had noticed. Not all people, not the ones who valued the management and the performance, but some of them. Enough of them. And one of them had been Evander Ashcroft. She had not been expecting him. That was the part she returned to most often in the long quiet of the locked room, the part that still had the power to move through her chest like weather. She had not been trying to catch his attention. She had been standing near the window at the Aldenmere ball, watching a very elderly man attempt to teach a very young woman the correct way to hold a fan, and she had found it so genuinely affecting, the patience of the old man and the polite confusion of the girl, that she had smiled before she could stop herself. And when she looked up from that smile, he had been watching her, not with the practiced appreciation of men who looked at young women as a matter of habit, not with the calculating interest of men who were measuring worth and background and what a particular face might bring to a particular name. He had been watching her with something quieter and more unsettling than any of that. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he had seen something in her face that answered a question he had stopped expecting to have answered. She had looked away. She had looked back. He had not moved. For 4 seconds, the world had been a very particular size, And then Isolde had appeared at her elbow with a glass of champagne and a smile, and the conversation had moved on, and the evening had continued, and nothing had happened. He had not crossed the room. He had not been introduced. They had exchanged nothing but that brief, bewildering moment of eye contact across a ballroom, and then the season had continued, and Araminta had told herself it was nothing, and she had almost believed it. 3 weeks later, she was in this room. She had never been able to make those two facts sit comfortably beside each other. The look and the locking. She knew there were things between them she did not have access to, decisions made in rooms she was not in, conversations that had happened without her. But she knew her sister. She knew how Isolde's mind worked, the particular mechanism of it, the way it identified threats not by what they were, but by what they might become. And she knew that a duke looking at her younger sister at a ball was, in Isolde's internal mathematics, a threat worth addressing at the earliest possible opportunity. She sat now on the narrow bed with her hands flat on her thighs and listened to the house. The sounds below had changed. Whatever conversation was happening at the gate had moved inside, which meant someone had opened the door, which meant Isolde had made a decision. This interested Araminta with a cold, careful attention. Isolde only opened doors when she had already calculated what was on the other side of them. If she had let him in, she believed she could manage him. She had probably already constructed a story, something clean and sad and plausible. Poor Araminta had taken ill. Poor Araminta had gone to the country for her health. Poor Araminta, always so fragile, would not be available for visiting. Araminta knew the story because she had heard Isolde telling it, through the floor, through the walls, in the particular way that old houses carried sound if you pressed yourself into the right corners and held very still. She had heard herself described as delicate, which she was not, as troubled, which was not the kind of trouble Isolde meant, as not quite herself, which was the truest lie of all, because she had never been more entirely herself than she was in this room with nothing left to perform and no one to perform it for. She heard footsteps now in the corridor outside. Not Isolde's. Isolde moved quietly and precisely, each step placed with purpose, a sound like something being measured. These footsteps were different. They were unhurried, but they covered ground. They were the footsteps of someone who was not being led anywhere, who was moving through this house as if the house belonged to them through some right that had nothing to do with ownership. They stopped outside her door. Araminta did not move. There was a silence that was different from all the silences she had collected over these 3 months. This one had weight to it, presence, as if the air on the other side of the door was being held differently than the air on her side, as if whatever was standing in that corridor was altering the character of the space around it simply by being there. She heard Isolde's voice, low and careful, and arranged into the particular shape of a woman who is trying to redirect attention without appearing to do so. She heard words like guest quarters and private, and I really do not think you need to concern yourself. And then she heard him. She had not heard his voice before, had never been close enough, never been in the right room, but she knew immediately that it was his, not because it was loud. He was not a man who raised his voice. She understood that instinctively, in the same way that you understand certain things about a fire before you have touched it. His voice was low and even, and it carried. It said something to Isolde that Araminta could not fully make out through the door, but she caught the shape of it, the direction of it, and what she understood was this. He was not asking permission. He had known exactly where she was before he entered this house. Araminta stood from the bed and walked to the door and pressed her palm against it and felt that faint vibration again, the house alive on the other side. And she thought of herself at 18 standing near a window watching an old man teach a young woman about fans. And she thought of a pair of eyes that had found her across a crowded room and had not looked away. And she thought of 4 seconds, and what 4 seconds could mean when they were the right 4 seconds between the right two people. Then she thought of what she looked like now. The hair at her jaw, The thinness of 3 months of insufficient meals slid through the gap under the door by a servant who would not meet her eyes. The dress she had worn so many times it had started to lose its shape. She thought of all the ways this room had worked on her, slowly and without drama, the way that small and relentless things always worked, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Shame. And then, moving in directly behind the shame, something harder and cleaner. Anger. Not at him. Not at herself. The anger that had been building in her for 3 months finally found its proper shape, and its proper name, and its proper address, and it lived at the other end of this corridor, and it was standing very close to a man who had come here knowing she was behind this door and who was not, if the sound of that voice was any indication, going to be told to leave. Araminta pressed her palm harder against the wood and breathed. She did not know what came next. She did not know what he had discovered, or why he had come, or what he intended to do about any of it. She did not know what she would say to him if this door opened, what her face would do, how much of the last 3 months would be visible in her without her permission. But she knew this. Whatever was about to happen on the other side of this door was the first thing that had happened to her in 3 months that she had not already seen coming. And that, after all this time, after all this silence, felt like something very close to beginning. If you're still with me till this moment, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. I truly appreciate you for sticking around. The door opened from the outside. Araminta had not heard a key. She had not heard Isolde give any instruction to any servant. What she heard was a single sound, brief and deliberate. And then the handle turned, and the door swung inward, and the light from the corridor came in first, wider and brighter than the thin grey light she had been living inside for 3 months, and she had to close her eyes against it for a moment, like someone surfacing from water. When she opened them, Evander Ashcroft was standing in the doorway. He was exactly as she remembered, and completely different. The same height, the same dark hair, the same quality of stillness she had noticed at the ball. But that had been a ballroom. He had been one figure among hundreds, framed by candlelight and distance, and the particular softness that crowds gave to individuals. Here he was just a man standing in a doorway, and there was nothing soft about him at all. His jaw was set. His eyes moved across the room with a quickness he did not try to conceal, taking in the narrow bed and the cold floor and the window too high to look out of and the stool beneath it, and she watched something move through his expression that he controlled very quickly but not quickly enough, something that looked like fury, quiet and contained, the kind that did not need to raise its voice because it had already made its decision. Behind him, in the corridor, Isolde stood very still. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful. Tall where Araminta was average, pale where Araminta was warm, controlled where Araminta was feeling everything always. She was wearing a morning dress, the colour of cream, and her hair was dressed perfectly, and her face was arranged into an expression of composed concern that was so precisely calibrated it would have convinced anyone who did not know her. It almost convinced Araminta, who did. Almost. Because underneath the composure there was that fear again, the thing Araminta had heard in her sister's voice through the floor before he came upstairs. It was still there. It lived in the very slight tension around Isolde's eyes, in the way she was standing just far enough back to suggest distance without appearing to retreat. Isolde was afraid, and she was managing that fear with everything she had. And the thing she was most afraid of was currently standing in the doorway of the room she had put her sister in and looking at what she had done. Evander did not look at Isolde. He had not looked at her once since the door opened. He was looking at Araminta. She did not know what her face was doing. She had lost the habit of managing her face in this room because there had been no one to manage it for, and she found now that she could not locate the correct arrangement, the one that said she was fine, that this was not as bad as it appeared, that she was not standing in a room she had been locked in for 3 months, with her hair cut to her jaw and her dress worn thin at the elbows. She found that her face was simply doing what it was doing, which was looking back at him with everything she had not said in 3 months sitting openly in it, and there was nothing she could do about that. He stepped into the room. He stopped a careful distance from her, not so close that it was improper, not so far that it was dismissal, the exact distance of a man who was being deliberate about every choice he made in this moment. He said her name, not Miss Voss, not the formal address that the rules of their world required. Her name, Araminta, as if he had said it before, privately, in a context she did not have access to, as if it was not the first time the word had been in his mouth. She said, very quietly, that she did not understand what he was doing here. He told her he would explain everything. But first he needed to know that she was unharmed. The word unharmed did something strange to her. It was such a specific word, not well, not all right, not the social words that people used when they were asking how you were without actually wanting to know. Unharmed. As if he had been carrying a specific fear about a specific thing and had chosen a word that addressed it directly. She looked at him and tried to understand what he knew and how he knew it and how long he had known it and why it had taken 3 months. She told him she was not harmed. She told him she was only tired. He looked at her for a long moment and she understood that he did not entirely believe the first part and completely believed the second. From the corridor, Isolde's voice arrived with its composure freshly reassembled. She said that she hoped Araminta understood that everything that had been done was for her own good, that she had been unwell and required quiet, that the family had only ever had her best interests at heart. She said these things in the voice of a woman reading from a text she had prepared in advance, smooth and sequential, each sentence following the last, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this particular speech and believed in the power of repetition to make things true. Evander turned then, just his head, just enough to look at Isolde over his shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. The silence he produced was the kind that made people feel it, and Isolde, for all her composure, was not immune. She added something about family privacy and the inappropriateness of outside interference. He turned back to Araminta. He said he had brought someone with him, that there was a woman waiting downstairs, a woman of considerable standing and complete discretion, who had agreed to accompany Araminta from this house today, if that was what Araminta wished. He said the choice was entirely hers. He was not here to take her anywhere she did not want to go. He was here because she deserved to have a choice, and from what he had been able to determine, choices had not been something she had been offered recently. Araminta felt the anger again, but it was different now. It was not the contained thing she had been holding against the door in the dark. It had air now. It had room. It was becoming something larger and cleaner, and she let it come because it was the most alive she had felt in 3 months, and she was done apologizing internally for taking up space. She asked him how he had known. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that when a woman disappears from every room she used to inhabit without explanation or farewell, people notice. The right people. He said he had begun asking questions in May when her absence became conspicuous, and that the answers had led him in directions he had not anticipated, and that what he had found at the end of those directions had required him to come here personally rather than send anyone in his place. She heard what he was not saying, that he had been looking for longer than she would have expected, that this had not been a casual inquiry, that he had left London in the middle of the season for this, for her, for the truth of what was in this room, and that was not a small thing. That was not the action of a man discharging a social obligation. That was something else, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly because the room was already full of so many things that were not being said directly. Isolde moved into the doorway. Her composure had sharpened into something that was less like calm and more like a weapon being raised. She said that Araminta was not going anywhere, that she was still recovering, and that the family would not be subjected to speculation and gossip, and that whatever the Duke believed he was doing, he did not have the authority to walk into a private home and remove a member of the family. Evander looked at her then, fully, for the first time since entering the room. Araminta watched her sister's face under that look, watched the composure hold, and then flicker, and then hold again. It was like watching someone stand their ground in a wind that was quietly increasing. He said, very calmly, that she was correct. He did not have the authority to remove anyone from a private home. He said it as if he was agreeing with her, as if he was conceding a point, and Isolde's chin lifted slightly with what Araminta recognized as the beginning of satisfaction. Then he said that he did, however, have in his possession a signed document from Lord Voss, their father, who had been located in Bath 3 days ago, and who had been unaware, until Evander's arrival, of the precise nature of the arrangements his eldest daughter had made in his absence. The room went very quiet. Isolde's face did something Araminta had never seen it do in her life. It lost its arrangement, just for a second, just long enough to show what was underneath the composure and the beauty and the usefulness, which was fear in its purest and most unmanaged form. Their father was alive. Their father knew. Araminta had not known he had been in Bath. She had not known where he was. She had asked, in the first weeks, through the servant who slid her meals under the door, and had received no answer. She had not known if he knew. She had not known if he had been told a version of the story that made it sensible, that made the locked room a kindness, that made Isolde the good daughter doing a difficult thing for the right reasons. She had not known if he had simply not asked. Now she knew. He had not known. And now he did. And Evander Ashcroft was standing in this room with her father's name on a piece of paper, and her sister's face had just come apart for 3 seconds and then put itself back together. And Araminta was 20 years old, and she had been on the floor of this room this morning because it was cold, and cold made her feel real. And she was done. She walked to the bed, and she picked up the only thing in the room that belonged to her, a small book of poems her mother had given her when she was 9, the single thing she had managed to keep through all of it. She held it against her chest, and she looked at Evander Ashcroft, and she said she would like to leave now. He looked at her with those eyes that gave away more than he probably intended, and he nodded once, and he stepped back to let her pass. She walked toward the door. She walked toward the light of the corridor and the sounds of the house below, and the life she had been held away from for 3 months. She walked past Isolde, close enough to hear her sister's breathing, close enough to see the exact shape of the fear she was carrying now, and she did not stop, and she did not speak, and she did not look at her. She had nothing left to say to Isolde today. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she heard Evander's voice behind her, still in the corridor, still quiet, still carrying. He was saying something to Isolde in a tone that was not raised and not hurried and not unkind. It was the tone of a man delivering a fact. Araminta did not hear the words, but she heard her sister's silence in response to them, and that silence told her everything she needed to know about what he had said, because Isolde had never been silent in her life unless something had taken the words completely from her. And whatever Evander Ashcroft knew, whatever was on that document, whatever he had found at the end of 3 months of asking the right questions of the right people, it was something that Isolde had believed was buried. Araminta descended the first step, then the second. Behind her the house held its breath, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone stepping back into the world after a long time away from it, that she was not walking out of a story that was ending. She was walking into one that had barely begun. The woman waiting downstairs was not what Araminta had expected. She had imagined someone soft, someone chosen for gentleness, for the particular kind of feminine comfort that people deployed when they wanted to manage a difficult situation without acknowledging that it was difficult. What she found at the bottom of the stairs was a woman of perhaps 50, upright as a soldier, with grey threading through dark hair and eyes that took in Araminta's appearance with a directness that was almost startling after 3 months of a servant who could not meet her gaze. The woman introduced herself as Lady Harriet Caldecott. She said it simply, without the social performance that names usually arrived wrapped in, and then she said that the carriage was ready and that there was food in it, real food, not the thin economies that had been slid under a door, and that Araminta was welcome to eat, or sleep, or simply sit in silence for as long as the journey required. Araminta said thank you, and meant it in the deepest part of herself. She did not look back at the house as they walked to the carriage. She had looked at that house for 3 months from the wrong side of a window, and she did not need to look at it again. She climbed in and sat against the cushioned seat and felt the difference between it and the stone floor, with her whole body, the warmth and the softness of it, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and did not cry. She had cried enough in that room. She was not going to cry now that she was out of it. Evander came last. He spoke briefly to one of the men outside, words she could not hear, and then he climbed in and sat across from her, and Lady Harriet settled beside Araminta with the composed ease of someone entirely comfortable with tense silences, and the carriage moved. For a while no one said anything. The food was bread and cold chicken and fruit, simple and abundant, and Araminta ate with a discipline she was quietly proud of, because what she wanted to do was eat like someone who had been given insufficient meals for 3 months, which she had been. She ate carefully. She looked out the window at London reassembling itself around her, the streets and the noise and the colour of it, the world that had continued without her while she had been in that room counting light on a floor. She had questions. She had so many questions that they had been pressing against the inside of her chest since the moment the door opened, and she was not sure which one to let out first, or whether letting any of them out in this carriage with this man across from her was wise or manageable. She was not certain what her face would do when the answers came. She was not certain she had enough composure left to receive difficult information gracefully, and she had a feeling the information was going to be difficult. Evander was watching her without appearing to watch her. She had noticed this at the ball, and it was still true. He had a quality of attention that did not announce itself, that sat quietly and gathered information without performing the act of gathering. It should have been unsettling. In some technical sense, it was unsettling. But it was also the first time in 3 months that she had been in a room, or a carriage, with someone who was paying attention to her as a person, rather than as a problem to be managed, and she found that she could not make herself resent it. She asked him about the document, about her father. He told her that Lord Voss had been in Bath for 6 weeks receiving treatment for a condition of the lungs that had worsened in winter. He said that Isolde had managed the communication between Bath and London with great efficiency, which meant that Lord Voss had received only the information Isolde chose to send him. He said that when Evander had arrived in Bath 4 days ago, and had told her father the truth of what was happening in the east wing of his own house, Lord Voss had wept. He said this last part carefully, without drama, because it was a painful thing, and it deserved to be said carefully. Araminta looked at her hands. Her father had wept. She turned that over slowly. She did not know what to do with it yet. She tucked it somewhere private and continued. She asked why he had started looking. In May, he had said, she had disappeared from society in late March, 2 months of absence before he had begun asking questions. She asked why May and not sooner, and she asked it without accusation because she genuinely wanted to understand. But she heard the edge in it anyway, the small, honest wound underneath the question, and she did not try to hide it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the carriage, the city moved. He said that in April he had made inquiries through ordinary channels and had been told she was unwell and had gone to the country. He said he had accepted this because it was plausible, because people did go to the country when they were unwell, and because he had no standing to inquire further. He said the word standing with a precise self-awareness that told her he understood exactly what he meant by it, that he had no formal claim on her, that he was a man who had exchanged 4 seconds of eye contact with a woman at a ball and had absolutely no socially sanctioned grounds for asking where she was. She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them with that same quality she remembered from the ballroom, the settled look of a man who had made a decision and was not going to unmake it. He said that in May he had been at a dinner where someone had made a passing remark about her continued absence, and that someone else had made a small joke about how thoroughly Isolde had managed to make her sister disappear, and that the joke had landed badly in his chest and had not left. He said that he had begun asking different questions after that, asking people who knew the family, asking servants who had been let go, following a thread that got thinner and darker the further he pulled it, until the thread led him to a room on the east wing of a house where a door had not been opened in 3 months. The carriage hit a rough patch of road and shifted, and they were both briefly closer than they had been, and then the road smoothed, and the distance returned, and neither of them remarked on it. Lady Harriet was looking out the window with the serenity of a woman who was professionally good at being present without being intrusive. Araminta asked where they were going. Evander said they were going to Caldecott House, which was Lady Harriet's residence, and which was, more importantly, a house that Isolde had no claim on and no access to and no ability to manage. He said she would be safe there. He said the word safe as if it was a promise and not just a description. She asked what happened next. He said that the document her father had signed gave formal acknowledgement of what had been done, and formal instruction for her care and autonomy going forward. He said that Isolde would not be able to use her father's illness or absence to exercise control over Araminta's circumstances again. He said this practically, with the even delivery of a man who had thought all of this through, and she could see the thinking in it, the careful architecture of it, the number of steps he had taken to make sure this particular outcome was solid before he drove to that gate. And that was when it reached her, fully. Not in pieces, as it had been coming to her since the door opened, but all at once, the whole shape of it. He had spent months on this. He had gone to Bath. He had found her father. He had arranged a safe house. He had brought Lady Harriet, a woman of standing and discretion, so that there would be nothing improper about any of it, nothing that could be used against Araminta afterward, no version of this that left her exposed. He had thought about her exposure. He had protected it in advance. He had done all of this for a woman he had looked at for 4 seconds at a ball. She said, quietly, that she did not understand why. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that he was not entirely sure he could explain it in a way that was adequate. He said that he had thought about that question during the months of looking and had not arrived at an answer that satisfied him. He said that she had looked at something small and human and true in that ballroom and had smiled at it with her whole face, unself-consciously, without any calculation at all, and that he had watched that happen and had understood in a way that was not convenient and not simple, that he did not want that to disappear from the world. The carriage was very quiet. Lady Harriet continued to look out the window. Araminta felt something moving in her that she did not have a clean name for. It was not the same thing she would have felt at 18 hearing something like this, the soft, romantic overwhelm of a girl who had not yet learned that the world was difficult. This was older than that. It had 3 months of stone floor in it. It had the weight of her mother's death and her father's silence and her sister's shears. It was something that understood cost and still moved toward warmth, because it was human, and warmth was what humans moved toward when they had the chance. But she was also afraid. She understood that. She sat with it honestly. She had been made small by someone she had loved, and she was only just outside the door of that room, and she did not know yet what shape she was, what had held and what had cracked, and what would need time she had not yet had. She told him that. Not all of it, but enough. She said that she was grateful. She said that she did not doubt what he had done or why. She said that she needed time to find herself again before she could offer anything to anyone, and she said it looking at him steadily, because she wanted him to understand that she was not pushing him away. She was simply telling him the truth, and truth was the thing she had been most starved of in that room, and she was not going to stop speaking it now just because it was inconvenient. He looked at her as if she had given him something. He said he understood. He said he was not in a hurry. He said this simply without performance, and she believed him because he had driven to Bath and found her father and come to that gate and waited. And a man in a hurry did not do any of that. The carriage slowed. London's edges were softening into the quieter streets of a different part of the city. And then Lady Harriet, who had been magnificently silent for the entirety of this exchange, said in a calm and pleasant voice that they would arrive in approximately 10 minutes, and that she had arranged a room with a proper fire and a bath with hot water and a meal that was not eaten in a moving carriage, and that all other matters, however pressing they might feel, could wait until Araminta had slept in a real bed. Araminta almost laughed. It came up suddenly and she caught it, but not all of it, and some of it escaped, and she felt Evander's attention shift at the sound of it, felt him go still the way he had gone still across a ballroom when she had smiled at an old man and a young girl. She looked at him. He was looking at her with something so unguarded that she looked away first. Outside, the city continued. Inside the carriage, something had been said that could not be unsaid, and something had been felt that could not be unfelt, and Araminta sat with her mother's book of poems against her chest, and the warmth of the carriage around her, and understood that she was not the same person who had been locked in that room. That room had taken things from her, but it had also, in the long quiet of it, given her something she had not had before. A knowledge of exactly what she was made of, a clarity about what she would and would not accept, a sense of her own dimensions that did not depend on anyone else measuring her. She was someone who had survived something, and she was sitting across from a man who had come looking for her when she had. The carriage stopped. She did not know yet what Evander Ashcroft had found at the end of that thread he had pulled in May. She did not know the full content of that document. She did not know what Isolde would do now that she had been exposed, and Isolde was not a woman who accepted exposure without response. She knew that. She knew her sister, which meant this was not finished. The carriage had stopped, but the story had not, and somewhere behind her, in a cream morning dress, Isolde was standing in a house that was suddenly much less defended than it had been this morning, and she was thinking, and when Isolde thought, things happened. Araminta stepped out of the carriage and onto solid ground, and looked up at the pale London sky, and breathed the air that was not the air of that room, and felt the whole complicated weight of what was coming settling around her like weather. She was ready. She was not entirely ready, but she was here, and she was standing, and that was where everything had to start. The room Lady Harriet had prepared was everything she had promised. There was a fire. There was hot water in a deep copper tub behind a screen in the corner. There was a dress laid across the bed, simple and well made, and not Araminta's, but clean and whole and belonging to no version of her that had ever been locked in a room. There was a meal on a small table by the window, covered with a cloth to keep it warm. There was a window that she could stand at without a stool. She stood at it for a long time before she did anything else. She looked out at the garden below, a quiet walled space with late spring colour still holding in it, and she let the outside world be outside and the inside world be inside, and she breathed until the two felt like they were in the same place again. That had been the worst of it in the East Wing, the sense that the world inside her and the world outside had slowly drifted apart until she could not be sure they were connected at all. She breathed until she could feel the connection again, until she was one thing in one place. Then she bathed and dressed and ate and slept, and the sleeping was the kind that had no dreams in it, only depth, the dark, soft nothing of a body that had finally been allowed to stop holding itself together by force. She woke in the late afternoon to the sound of voices below. She lay still and listened and understood from the cadence of it that it was not alarming, just the sounds of a house in which things were happening. She dressed again, slowly, taking time with it, choosing the way she put herself together with an attention she had not been able to give herself in 3 months. She looked in the mirror for the first time without flinching. The hair was still short. She was still thinner than she should be. But her eyes were her own eyes again, and that was the thing that mattered. She went downstairs. Evander was in the front room with Lady Harriet and a third person she did not recognize, a man of middle age with ink-stained fingers and the careful bearing of someone who worked with documents. They looked up when she entered, and the conversation stopped in a way that told her the conversation had been about her, which she had expected. Evander stood. He always stood when she entered a room. She noticed this the second time it happened and filed it without comment. Lady Harriet introduced the ink-fingered man as Mr. Prentice, a solicitor of long standing and complete discretion. She said these words with the same weight she gave to everything, as if discretion were a quality to be named and respected rather than assumed. Araminta sat down and looked at the documents on the table between them and said she would like to understand everything now, not the softened version, not the version arranged to protect her from distress, everything. Mr. Prentice looked at Evander. Evander looked at Araminta and nodded once, which she understood as him telling the solicitor that she meant what she said and that she was capable of hearing it. Mr. Prentice began. It took some time. When he finished, the room was very quiet and the fire had burned lower, and Araminta was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into a stillness that was costing her considerably more than it appeared to. The shape of it was this. Her mother had not left the estate equally between her daughters. She had left a specific sum, held in trust, to be released to Araminta on her 20th birthday or on the occasion of her marriage, whichever came first. It was not a small sum. It was the kind of sum that changed the material conditions of a life. It was the kind of sum that, in the hands of the younger daughter, would have made the older daughter's position as the necessary and indispensable manager of the family's finances considerably less powerful. Isolde had known about the trust for years. Their father had not known that Isolde knew. Their father, in his grief and his withdrawal and his long seasons away from London for the sake of his lungs, had trusted Isolde to manage things, and had not thought carefully enough about what Isolde was managing or why. Araminta's 20th birthday was in 6 weeks. She sat with this. She sat with the fact that her sister had not locked her away because of a look across a ballroom. Or not only because of that. She sat with the fact that a look across a ballroom had been the catalyst, but the architecture underneath it was older and more calculated, that Isolde had been watching this date approach for years, that the locked room was not cruelty for its own sake, but cruelty with a purpose, which was in some ways worse. She sat with the fact that if she had remained in that room for 6 more weeks, her birthday would have passed, and the terms of the trust required her physical presence and signature to release the funds, and Isolde had clearly understood this and had clearly planned around it. She sat with all of this for a long time. Then she said, very calmly, that she would like to know what could be done. Mr. Prentice said a great deal could be done. He said that Lord Voss's signed acknowledgement of the circumstances, combined with testimony from the servant who had been tasked with her care and who had already agreed to speak, combined with the witness of the Duke of Aldenmere who had seen the room with his own eyes, constituted a foundation that Isolde would find very difficult to argue against in any formal context. He said that the trust could be protected. He said that there were actions available to them. Araminta asked about her father. Evander told her that Lord Voss was returning from Bath, that he had arranged transport and that he expected her father to arrive in London within 2 days. That her father had asked, through Evander, whether Araminta would be willing to see him, and that he had made clear to Lord Voss that this was entirely Araminta's decision and that no one would press her either way. She asked what her father had said when Evander told him. What he had actually said. Evander looked at her with that unguarded quality she was beginning to recognize as the version of him that was most true. He said that her father had held the information for a long time without speaking, and then had said that he had failed her in every way a father could fail someone, and that he would spend whatever time remained to him attempting to be worth her forgiveness, and that he understood if forgiveness was not available. Araminta pressed her lips together. She looked at the window. She looked back. She said she would see him. That evening Isolde came. She came without announcement, which told Araminta that she was desperate, and she came alone, which told Araminta she had calculated that witnesses would not serve her here. She arrived at Caldecott House with her composure reconstructed to its full height, and her beauty deployed like armor, and she asked to speak to her sister privately. Lady Harriet looked at Araminta. Araminta said yes. They sat in a small room off the main corridor, just the two of them, with the door closed and the evening light coming through a single window and the sounds of the house moving distantly around them. Isolde sat very straight. She looked at Araminta with an expression that was almost recognition, as if she was seeing her clearly for the first time in years, and perhaps she was. She said she had not intended for things to go as far as they had. Araminta said nothing. Isolde said that she had been afraid, that the pressures of managing the family, managing their father's illness, managing the finances and the house, and the expectations had become more than she could carry alone, and that the thought of Araminta arriving into her majority with resources and independence had frightened her in a way she had not known how to manage. She said she was not asking for forgiveness. She said she only wanted Araminta to understand. Araminta looked at her sister. She looked at her for a long time, at the beauty and the control and the fear underneath both of them, at the 11-year-old girl who had decided that grief was too expensive and had closed the door on it and had lived without it ever since, and she felt something that was not forgiveness and not hatred, and not love of the old uncomplicated kind. It was something more adult than any of those, something that understood the damage without excusing it. She said that she understood. She said it quietly, and she meant it fully. Then she said that understanding was not the same as acceptance, that she would not bring formal disgrace on the family, not for their father's sake and not for the sake of a name that was still hers too. But she said that the trust would be released on her birthday as her mother had intended, and that Isolde would have no further management of any funds or decisions that belonged to Araminta. She said this not as a threat but as a fact, in the even tone of someone who has learned the difference between asking permission and stating terms, and the difference had been learned in a cold room on a stone floor, and it was not a lesson she was going to forget. Isolde looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood and said that she understood. She left without the composure quite as assembled as it had been when she arrived, and Araminta sat in the small room alone for a while and let the silence be different from every other silence she had sat in recently. This one was hers. She had made it. It belonged to her. Later, when the house had quieted and Lady Harriet had retired and the candles were low, she found Evander in the front room. He was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at the dark garden, and she had the sense that he had been standing there for a while, that he was a man who stood at windows when he was thinking in the same way she did, and the small symmetry of it landed softly inside her. She stood beside him. He turned slightly and then was still, both of them looking out at the dark. She told him that Isolde had come. He said he knew. She said she had not brought disgrace on the family. He said he thought that was right, if it was what she wanted. She said it was not entirely what she wanted, but it was what she had decided, and that the two things were sometimes different, and that was all right. He looked at her then, turned from the window completely. She turned too. She told him that she had been thinking about what he had said in the carriage, about not being in a hurry. She said she had been turning it over, and she wanted him to know that she was not, in the clear light of everything she now understood, someone who intended to make him wait indefinitely while she arranged herself into something more presentable. She was not going to be apologetic about what the room had done to her, or how long it might take to finish undoing it. But she was also not afraid of him, and she was not afraid of this, whatever this was, and she thought he deserved to know that. He said, carefully and without looking away, that he had come to find her, without knowing what he would find, and without conditions on what came next. He said she did not owe him a particular version of herself. He said that the woman who had smiled at a small and human thing across a ballroom was the same woman standing here, and that was all he had ever been interested in, the whole of her, not a curated portion. She felt the full weight of that. Let it settle. Did not rush past it. She said she was going to need time. He said he had time. She said she was going to be difficult occasionally, that she had always been too much of something, according to someone, and that she was done managing that perception. He said that too much of something had always sounded to him like more than enough. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire had gone low, and the candles were burning toward their ends, and outside the London night was full of all its ordinary noise, and none of it touched the quality of the room around them. She did not reach for him. He did not reach for her. There was time for that. There was something much better than urgency available to them, which was the particular patience of two people who have been through difficult things and have come out of them knowing the difference between what is fleeting and what is not. She said good night. He said good night. She went upstairs and she lay in a real bed in a warm room, and she pressed her mother's book of poems to her chest, and she thought about all of it. The months behind her and the weeks ahead, and the father who was on his way home, and the sister who had left a room diminished, and the man downstairs who had pulled a thread in May because something had not sat right in his chest. She thought about 4 seconds. What 4 seconds could build, given enough time and enough truth and enough willingness to stay when staying was hard. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 months, the dark felt like rest. Her father arrived on a Tuesday. She knew he was coming because Evander had told her the previous evening, quietly, at the end of a dinner where Lady Harriet had done most of the talking, and Araminta had eaten a full meal without thinking about it, which was the first time that had happened in longer than she could properly account for. He had told her gently and without ceremony, the way he told her most things, as if information was something a person deserved to receive with dignity rather than management. She had not slept well that night, not badly either. She had lain in the warm room and thought about her father in the particular way you think about someone you love and are also angry with and also grieve. All 3 feelings existing together without resolving into any single one. She had practiced nothing. She had not arranged what she would say, or how she would look, or what expression she would have when he walked in. She had made a decision in the small hours of the morning that she was done arranging herself in advance of things. Whatever happened when she saw him would happen, and she would feel what she felt, and that would be enough, because it was true. He was thinner than she remembered. That was the first thing. He had always been a broad man, solid in the way of men who had once been physically active and had carried the shape of it into middle age. The man who came through Lady Harriet's front door was wearing that shape loosely now, as if something had been taken out of him that had previously been keeping him full. His hair had gone further into grey. His eyes, when they found her across the entrance hall, were her eyes. She had always known they were the same, but she felt it now in her chest, the inheritance of it, the way certain things passed between people without permission. He stopped when he saw her. She stayed where she was. He said her name, and it came out wrong, broken in the middle, and she understood that he had been holding it at considerable tension for the journey, and the saying of it had released something he had not entirely been prepared to release in a doorway in front of Lady Harriet and 2 servants. She crossed the hall. She did not think about it. Her body made the decision before she did, which was the most honest thing she had done in recent memory, and she put her arms around her father and felt him hold her with the particular desperation of a person who has understood too late what they almost lost, and she let him, and she did not pretend that it did not matter. They sat in the small room off the corridor, the same room where she had sat with Isolde, and she thought briefly about what that room was becoming, a space where difficult things were said and then survived, and she thought that was not a bad thing for a room to be. Her father talked for a long time. He talked about her mother's illness and his grief, and the way he had retreated from everything that required him to feel things, including his daughters, including his responsibilities, including the basic business of being present in his own life. He talked about how Isolde had filled that absence so completely that he had let her, had been grateful for it without asking what it was costing, without asking what Isolde was doing with the power he had handed her by stepping back. He said he had been a coward. He said it plainly, without dressing it in more forgiving language, and she respected him for that. She asked him if he had known, at any point, that something was wrong. He said that he had known something was wrong, and had chosen to understand it as something else. He said that he had been told she was unwell, and had not pressed, because pressing would have required engagement, and engagement was what he had been avoiding for years. He said this was not an excuse. He said it was only the truth of how a person could fail someone without a single dramatic act of cruelty, through the slow accumulation of looking away. She said she understood. He looked at her sharply, the way her mother used to when she thought Araminta was being too generous too quickly. She said she meant it. She said she was not forgiving carelessly. She said she understood the difference between understanding someone's failure and pretending it did not happen, and that she was not pretending. She was 20 years old, almost, and she had spent 3 months in a cold room being made small, and she had come out of it knowing things about herself and about people that she would not have known otherwise. And one of those things was that people were capable of enormous damage without meaning it, and that the damage was real regardless of the meaning, and that both of those things could be true at the same time. He was quiet after that. Then he said he wanted to be her father properly. Not from birth, not through managed correspondence, not as an absence that Isolde filled on his behalf. He said he knew it would take time, and that he was not asking her to simply resume something that had not been working even before the room. He said he was asking for the chance to try something different, to be present, to ask how she was and mean it, and wait for the real answer. She looked at him for a long time. She said yes. It was not a large yes. It was not the yes of a girl who trusted completely and without reservation. It was the yes of a woman who had decided that a chance was worth giving when it was genuinely asked for, and that withholding it would cost her more than offering it would. It was a yes with conditions she did not spell out, because he was her father and she believed he already understood them, and believing that was itself a form of beginning. In the days that followed, the house settled into something Araminta had not lived inside before. Not the managed quiet of the East Wing. Not the performative warmth of a social occasion. Something more ordinary than either of those, with more texture to it, more room for imperfection. Lady Harriet moved through it with her particular grace, providing structure without imposition, meals and routines, and the occasional sharp observation about the world that made Araminta laugh, the real laugh, not the social one, the one that came from somewhere lower and truer. Her father stayed. He sat in rooms with her. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He was clumsy at it sometimes, reaching for the old habits of distance and then catching himself and returning. And she watched this effort with something that was neither pity nor judgment, but a recognition of what it cost him and a quiet decision to receive it. Evander came every other day. He came in the afternoons mostly, and he and Araminta would walk in Lady Harriet's garden or sit in the front room with tea going cold between them, while they talked about everything and nothing in the unhurried way of people who have stopped trying to make an impression on each other. He told her about his estate in Wiltshire, about the tenants and the land, and the particular difficulty of a house that was large enough to be impressive and old enough to require constant attention in the way that old things did. She told him about her mother's book of poems, reading him passages not because they needed commentary, but because some things were worth sharing simply for the sharing. She told him about the light that moved across the floor of the East Wing room, how she had watched it for 3 months, how she had learned the hours by it. He listened without trying to fix what she was telling him, which was the thing she had needed most and had not known how to ask for. One afternoon, 10 days after she had left the East Wing, she asked him something she had been holding. She asked if it had frightened him, what he had found when the door opened, the room, her in it. He thought about this honestly, which she had come to understand was his primary mode. He did not reach for the reassuring answer. He said yes. He said that the room had been exactly what he had feared it would be, and that walking into it had required him to keep his face in order in a way that had cost him considerably. He said that she had been standing in the middle of it, and had looked at him with everything she had been carrying fully visible, and that it had been one of the most humbling things he had ever witnessed, not her diminishment, but her dignity inside it. He said that she had not folded, that after everything she was still entirely herself, and that had made him afraid and proud in the same breath, two things he had no right to feel about her, and felt anyway. She said he could feel them. She said he had earned at least that much. He looked at her in that unguarded way, and she did not look away this time. She said she wanted to tell him something. He waited. She said that she had spent a great deal of her life being told she was too much, too visible, too feeling, too present, and that she had spent a corresponding amount of time trying to manage herself down into a size that was more acceptable, and that the room had actually, in its terrible way, finished that project for her, not by succeeding at it, by showing her what the end of it looked like, what happened when you made someone small enough, what was left. She said she had looked at what was left and had decided she was not going to spend another year of her life working toward that end. She said she was too much, and she intended to remain so. He said, without hesitation, that he was counting on it. She reached across the small space between them and put her hand over his, briefly, and then took it back. And the briefly was not because she wanted less than that, but because she was learning the difference between rushing toward something and walking toward it. And the walking mattered. The walking was the part that made the arriving mean something. He looked at the space where her hand had been, and then looked at her, and the question and the answer were both in the look, and neither of them needed to speak it. 3 weeks later, on the morning of her 20th birthday, Mr. Prentice arrived with documents. Her father sat with her while she signed them. The trust her mother had arranged so many years ago, quietly and with great love and considerable foresight, released into her name. She held the paper for a moment after, and thought about her mother sitting at a desk somewhere in this city, making these arrangements, thinking about the daughter who felt everything, trying to make sure the world could not make her too small to stand in it. She pressed her palm flat against the paper. Thank you, she thought. Thank you for knowing. That evening there was a small dinner. Just the people who had been inside all of this with her. Her father, quieter than he used to be, and more present for the quietness. Lady Harriet, magnificent in dark green, proposing a toast with an economy of sentiment that somehow contained more feeling than a longer speech would have. Evander, across the table, watching her in the way she had stopped looking away from. After, when the others had drifted to other rooms, she and Evander stood in the garden in the early summer evening. London was soft around them, the light going gold and slow. She could hear the city, but it was distant, a hum rather than a press, the world keeping a respectful distance. She told him she was going to be all right. He said he knew. She said she meant something more than all right. She meant she was going to be fully, inconveniently, excessively herself in the world from now on, and that anyone who found that to be too much was welcome to look elsewhere. He said that sounded exactly right to him. She turned and looked at him in the gold evening light, this man who had pulled a thread in May because something had not sat correctly in his chest, who had gone to Bath and come to a gate and opened a door, who had said he had time and had meant it. She looked at him and she thought about 4 seconds in a ballroom, and what 4 seconds could grow into when the two people involved were willing to be honest and patient and present and unafraid of the difficulty of real things. She thought it could grow into something very considerable. She did not say this. She was saving some things for later, for the longer story, for the chapters ahead of them that were not yet written. She was learning the pleasure of anticipation, the particular sweetness of knowing that something good was coming, and choosing to let it come at its own pace, rather than rushing to meet it. She said good night. He said good night. She went inside and upstairs and stood at the window of her room, the window she could stand at without a stool, and looked out at the garden below where he was still standing for a moment before he moved. And she thought about the version of herself who had sat on a stone floor because it was cold, and cold was the only thing that made her feel real. She was warm now, all the way through, and the story, the real one, the one that had been gathering itself in the dark of that room, and in the light of these weeks, and in the 4 seconds of a look across a ballroom 3 years before she understood what it meant, that story was not ending here. It was only, at last, truly beginning. If you're still with me till this end, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. I truly appreciate you for sticking till the end. I hope you enjoyed every bit of the story. I will be there in the comments.